Sitting opposite me today is Steve Baker, a Conservative MP who first came into politics after watching the 2008 financial crisis unfold. Steve Baker, thanks for talking to us. Tell me, what was it about the financial crisis that you found so revealing and so galvanising in terms of your future?
Well, the first thing was that the Lisbon Treaty had set me off because it was such an obvious trampling of democracy that I wasn't prepared to tolerate it, and that was the final straw. But no sooner had I reached that final point than the financial crisis began to unfold, and I'd been following the Austrian School of Economics since 2000. When the dot-com bust happened, I was looking for a reason why, because I was doing a master's degree at Oxford trying to get into software, and suddenly my investment didn't look so wise. So I discovered the Austrian School, the monetary theory of the trade cycle, predicted very much what happened then and what's happening now, but I cast it aside because I thought if there was anything in it, the economists and the politicians would sort out the monetary regime, the banking system, and of course they didn't. So when the crisis broke, I was delighted. I was still on a trajectory to Parliament, and I co-founded the Cobden Centre to try and get these ideas out in the public space. One
of the things that you've campaigned against quite vociferously is bailouts. Does that mean that you think a Lehman-type event would be good for the EU economy?
Well, none of these things really are good. The problem is not so much whether one piece of dreadful pain or another would be a good thing. It's how to best get back to sustainable, inclusive prosperity, which people can see is just. Now, what we've had is, particularly the last 13 years, the money supply in the UK, M4, tripled under New Labour. This great torrent of new money goes to particular sections of society first, creates all sorts of unwanted and unhelpful economic activity, and then the chaos sooner or later has to be revealed. And that chaos was revealed, for example, because it's happened worldwide, it was revealed in Lehman Brothers. But I don't want the pain, but what I recognise is that the sooner we take the pain and the correction and the adjustment, which is inevitable, the sooner we'll get back to sustainable prosperity, which is the best way to fight poverty.
Surely the justification for bailouts is that they are a stabilising mechanism.
Well, people just desperately do not want pain, and I include politicians and economists in that, of course the public as well. But really, the whole economy right around the world has been painted into a corner now. We've had cheap interest rates, artificially cheap interest rates, and consequently a great flood of new money. The choice now is either continue having a flood of new money, which you can see at the moment is the choice with QE, although they're modest quantities. Either keep having new money, and ultimately that will lead to inflation, and probably accelerating inflation, or you stop accelerating the supply of new money and you take a correction. Now, neither path is painless. What I'm arguing is that those two paths are inevitable. At the moment, we're stuck in a sort of stagnation, but it won't go on forever.
The UK is a country with a strong banking lobby, though. How likely is it, do you think, that a no bailout policy would be instigated?
Well, it doesn't feel very likely at the moment.
What role do banks play in politics?
Well, at the moment, the situation is that banks and the state are very, very tightly interwoven. The idea that banks are free market institutions is faintly ridiculous. They're absolutely riven by, not only by privileges like taxpayer-funded deposit insurance and lender of last resort, also the whole credit markets are centrally planned by the central banks. So they are actually, banks themselves are part of an enormous monetary power in the world, which is directed by central banks. So they're very, very tightly coupled. Also, when you look at the revenues from the banking system, you can see that the banking system and inflationary money is a very important part of funding the welfare state. So they're incredibly tightly coupled. I don't actually think that's very healthy or in anybody's best interests.
How do you characterise then that relationship between the banks and the state? Is it a sinister kind of a partnership?
Sinister's kind of the wrong word, and with these things I try to stay very close to the literature and to facts, because obviously there are people out there with all sorts of wild ideas. I don't think it's sinister. I think it's the automatic consequence of people having commercial interests and seeking to capture the state, as people have always sought to done in all sorts of industries, seeking to capture the state to their own advantage. So it's not sinister, but what it is unhealthy, and it's also completely understandable given the sort of public choice factors involved.
You mentioned central banks just a minute ago, but you say that economies can get on perfectly well without central banks.
Yeah, well, you look at the United States, the Federal Reserve's a relatively recent innovation, and it was supposed to stabilise prices, and no sooner was it implemented, then there was an enormous boom ending in a dreadful bust, which at least prior to this one was the worst the world had ever seen. And so I don't think that central banks are actually a stabilising factor. I think they're a destabilising factor. I'm a big advocate of free banking, but you know what? I'm not alone. Alan Greenspan wrote a wonderful essay called Golden Economic Freedom, in which he advocated free banking, as in banking without central banks. So I think we should have this conversation.
How would it work, though, without that overseeing body?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question, because in more or less any area of economic life, we take for granted that there isn't a central planning authority. We don't have a tractor planning authority or a bread planning authority in the UK, or indeed in the United States. We just know that there'll always be tractors and there'll always be bread. In fact, there'll always be a rich variety of bread of different kinds at different price points. But when it comes to money and banking, the commodity, where money is the commodity on one half of every commercial transaction, we take for granted the existence of committees of wise men planning its price and quantity. So sometimes I think it's like the emperor's new clothes. What's wrong in the world is the system of banking and of money and credit. That system is centrally planned in a way that we would not tolerate with any other commodity, precisely because we know if it was centrally planned, they'd get it wrong. So yeah, the emperor's new clothes need to be, the emperor's naked. It has to be revealed, and we should be really looking hard at central banks and how they're destabilising our whole social system.
Who is it then that needs central banks? Is it politicians that can't let go of them?
Bankers need central banks. If you were to trace back through the way that banks work, Mervyn King said of all the many ways of organising banking, the worst is the one we have today. So what characterises banking? We have fiat money, money backed by nothing. Notes and coins are just paper money and token coins. But actually most of the money supply is accounting entries. But it doesn't account for anything, it's just an accounting entry. So that's the first thing. We have fractional reserve deposit taking, which means that when you put your money in your current account, it belongs to the bank. They're able to use it to fund themselves. Taxpayer-funded deposit insurance, lender of last resort, and central planning. All of these things taken together are hugely destabilising, and actually they're not helping. So how would it work? The way it would work in a free banking system, you'd have a commodity as the basis of money, normally gold or silver in the past. You wouldn't have limited liability for bank directors, and again, that used to be normal. People used to accept partnerships, trustee savings banks, mutuals, instead of profit-making, because the various factors involved are toxic taken together. I'm all for profit-making, but what you can't have is profit-making and bailouts. So the way it would work is the normal rules of contract, property would work, instead of having this system of state planning, state control and legal privileges. So it would work through the free market.
Quantitative easing's another bugbear of yours. You say it's part of the problem and not a solution to the crisis.
Yeah, so what's happened, if you look back, particularly over the 40 years since Bretton Woods, but especially the last 13 years, there was an enormous increase in the money supply. We've based our economy on that increasing money supply. So the crazy thing about QE is it's not actually new, this idea of increasing the money supply. It's just that it was previously much more insidious. What's happening with QE is it's just ducking the problem. The central banks, politicians are trying to restart the money creation process in the hope that the economy will restart, everybody get re-elected, and the cruel fantasy is being maintained that everything can go on as it was before. So what QE is doing is maintaining a cruel fantasy, and it's also introducing further distortions, because who gets the new money first? Banks, people close to banks, the state. It's just further distorting our economy towards banking, towards housing, towards the state, and it really is not a healthy direction of travel.
The US, as we know, has done a lot of quantitative easing. How much inflation is the US exporting globally with that policy?
Well, I think the US is exporting considerable inflation. In fact, if you look, not particularly a gold bug, but there's a wonderful website, pricedingold.com. If you look at the price of oil in gold, it's been stable since the end of the Second World War. It's been low and stable. The price has hardly increased. In fact, last time I checked, the price of oil in gold was lower than it was at the end of the Second World War. If you look at the price in dollars, of course, since 1971, the price of oil has been high and very volatile. And there's something going on here that is obviously to do with the supply of dollars, because the supply of gold is relatively fixed. supply of dollars is relatively volatile, and as a result oil, which is that universal global commodity traded in dollars, is high and volatile. So I think actually there's a really profound and fundamental problem with the dollar and commodity prices. I've put it on the record in Hansard, I've asked the government to look at it. I really just want to keep pushing that, banging that drum, to see if we can get some sense into our monetary order.
Back in this country, and you say we're in a crisis of state intervention. What does that mean?
It's been true for most of the last 40 years. That governments have spent more than they could take in taxation. They've then borrowed, and then they've allowed the currency to be debased through the credit markets. And this whole nexus of state intervention in the economy, state debasement of money, is ruined us. But I'd add to it, it was once enough to say that capitalism was the private ownership of the means of production. But then ownership also meant control and the private bearing of commercial risks. But today, people may well own capital, but they end up so constrained by regulation and taxation that they don't really effectively control it. And you can see in banking that they don't bear their own commercial risks. So this is not a capitalist system, it's a heavily interventionist system.
So basically you're all for rolling back the state?
Well, I am for rolling back the state, but it's not for some spinning-eyed ideological reason. It's just obvious that our present social system is manufacturing poverty and injustice. So what I want is a system which manufactures justice and prosperity, and it seems to me we've got a choice. We can either roll forward the state, which from current levels means effectively becoming communists, or we can roll back the state from where we are, roll back regulation, accept the need to allow corrections to prices, to wages, to interest rates, and allow the forces of social cooperation to generate the wealth that we know that they can. So, of course it's difficult and it's frightening, because 2/3 of government spending in the UK is welfare, health, education and debt interest. Now, we're not going to have lower taxes in a smaller state without reducing spending on those areas. And I recognise that. That's why I talk so often about mutuals. I really think that welfare and health, in particular, would be better delivered by mutualising those services.
It is worrying though, isn't it? I mean, if you roll back the welfare state, isn't there a huge risk of leaving the poorest and most vulnerable in society exposed?
Well, this is why I'm so insistent that we must change the system of money, because this cycle, it's a complex cycle of state spending on a deficit plus currency debasement to maintain this idea that we can all live at each other's expense through the state. It's increasingly obvious that it is a cruel fairy tale. Now, I come from a very ordinary background. My mother, my father are dependent on their state pension and the NHS, but it's a cruel fiction. We have to get to the point where we're actually able to sustain ourselves in a way which can go on indefinitely. Because at the moment, if we look forward and just look at the Western world's debt projections, it is obvious that in our lifetimes, and I mean in our lifetimes, the current system of society will come to an end. The question is not whether it will, it's when it will and the manner in which it happens. And politicians are going to have to really step up to the mark and be honest with the public and say, we just cannot meet these promises. We need to make new promises which can be met, fund them honestly, and have a productive and inclusive economy which is just and moral.
Steve Baker, thank you very much.
You're most welcome.